Hi, I'm Dave Clayton, Training Manager for Astute Graphics, and I'd love to thank you for joining me in this 15-minute or so overview of Astute Graphics plugins and how they can be used to add depth and details to your map creations. Now you can find out more about who we are and our plugins at astutegraphics.com, but for this session we're just going to look at 4 of our creative tools. We'll look at Vector First Aid for cleaning your files, AG Offset, which is our live offset effect, Texturino, which is our texture application and manager tool, and that includes the texture brush and the opacity brush. And finally we'll look at Phantasm, which is perfect for adding extra effects and colour editing. Now we're going to be looking at this map of Hawaii supplied by Avenza, and using the tools I just mentioned we'll add some detail to this and also do some cleaning up. If you have the Astute Graphics plugins installed, you just need to come up to Window, Astute Graphics, and you'll see here a full list of all the plugins available that have panels assigned to them. Now I've already opened up the ones for this session, so I've got them open up and docked ready to go. So let's begin with Vector First Aid and see if we can clean some of this artwork up. We won't do a full clean as some of the elements need to be left alone, so we need to be quite judicious in what we can work on. We don't want to undo or break any of the elements of the map that are required with Map Publisher being active. So what we can do with Vector First Aid is look at the document whole and see what things we can repair and what things we can leave behind. So to do this, with the Vector First Aid panel open, just click on Check Document. Now what that's going to do is then go into the document and start looking for the things it thinks it can fix. Now sometimes this is a quick check and sometimes it can take a little bit longer. But once it's finished checking, you'll see a list of all those items in the panel in this area here. Now that the check's finished, you can see a list of all the items that Vector First Aid thinks you could fix. Now, if you've completely finished with Map Publisher and you've no reason to go back to it and you're exporting this artwork as it is, then we could go ahead and click Fix All. Because we don't need to go back to Map Publisher, this is now exported artwork and we can do with it what we want. If you were going to go back to Map Publisher, what I'd recommend is you look through the list and see if there's any items you think you can fix that won't be affected. For instance, we can do 827 redundant points. We can fix selected. We can also use 7 unused graphic styles because they're in the graphic styles panel, so we can fix that as well. And as we come down, we can see all these other items that can be fixed as well. So we'll just fix one more. So you can make a decision on which items you want to fix. We'll just leave that for now because all I wanted to do was show you the power of Vector First Aid and how it can identify any inconsistencies or things that are damaged in your artwork and just fix it for you. Now doing this not only cleans the artwork, but it can also reduce the file size. So now that it's cleaned up, let's move on to AG Offset and add some detail to the coastline by creating a blended multi-offset to highlight the seashore. So let's just look at the layers panel first and find the area that we're going to work on. So I want to work on this coastline, so I'm just going to select this layer here because this is the one we're going to work on, and this is this blue line that goes all the way around the coastline. We'll come over to AG Offset and we're just going to reset this to defaults, and I'm going to show you how to start to build the effects onto this map. Just click on the flyout and go to default settings, and that's going to reset everything. So the first thing we're going to do is just click on the apply AG Offset, and what that's going to do is give our first offset. Now up here we have a distance which is set as a default, and we only have one step at the moment. If we look up the top here, we've also got a fill color and a stroke color, and we can change that, so we'll come back to that shortly. But for now, let's just add a second step. And what this has done is given us 2 steps, and we can see here we've got this grey stroke that we've got applied there. Now I'm going to turn this total off, and what I'm going to do is just reduce it just slightly so you can see the live change. Now if we want to, we can now add a 3rd step and even a 4th. And you can see there what it's starting to do is build offsets on top of each other. Now had you been doing this natively, you'd have had to have gone into one, come back out, go in and set the second one, whereas this panel gives you this live effect so you can keep changing the steps and the distance and some of these other settings. So let's come down here and look at these two. Here we can also change the stroke color blend and also the fill color blend. So let's just look at this fill color first. What we're going to do is change it to alter color, and you can see there, because the default is black, you can already see the change starting to apply there. We're going to change that, and we're going to go to a really light blue color here. So we're just going to select about there, and what that's going to do is straight away give us that really nice blend. Now if we want to, we can still change this distance, so we can still increase it and decrease it, but we're not going to go too big. We're going to keep it nice and tight to the coastline. Now what we can also do is change that stroke color, so we can come in here to alter color, and we can also change this and maybe change that to a white color as well. So that gives us this really nice blend. Now the second thing we can do is also alter the opacity. So if we just tick on that and click 50%, and what that's going to do is give the effect a 50% opacity. Now we can still change the opacity up here as well. So if I was to go and change that also to 50, you'll see that that also reduces, so we can combine this opacity with this opacity over here. So it depends really what kind of effect you're looking for. We're just going to increase this back to about 75. And what that's done is given us a really nice coastline effect that is editable the whole time, so we can always go back into this if we want. And this is the beauty of Astute Graphics effects, is they always remain live. And just to show you that there is a live effect, if we come over here to the appearance panel, we can see AG offset there in the stack, and then we can just click on that to edit the effect. So that's AG offset, which is part of stylism, and as we've just shown there, it's a really cool way of adding multiple offsets to your artwork. Now that we've used AG offset, let's look at adding some texture to some of the coloured areas on the map, and then use the texture brush to mask some out, and I'll also show you how to paint some of that texture back in. Now this is for demonstration purposes only. You can import your own textures to apply to your map objects using the texture manager, and it's a great way of managing and categorizing your textures. We also provide free textures to all Astute Graphics subscribers. Now that we have the texture panel open, what we're going to do is select an element on a map and we're going to apply a texture. I'm also going to show you how to use the texture brush to brush some of that texture back in and back out, and we'll also look at the opacity brush to show how different that is to the texture brush. So let's select an area and add our first texture. I'm just going to select this green area here. I'm going to come over to the layers panel just to make sure I've got the right object selected, and then with Texturino open, what I'm going to do is look at the panel here and say, okay, I've got a category. Now this already has some categories that I've opened which are supplied to all Astute Graphics subscribers. Now I'm going to select all because the one I want to choose is a grassy one. So if I come down here, I'm going to find it under grass lawn. So I'm just going to click on grass lawn and I get a preview here. Now just to apply the texture, all you need to do is click the plus sign. And what that does is it applies the texture to that object. Now we've got some annotations here which allow us to make some changes to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag this scale in. You can see as we start to drag it in, you can see the border of it. Now don't worry if you go inside of the object, because what it will do is it will actually repeat. So I'm just going to make that nice and small. I don't want it too big, because if you make it too big, it looks a little bit too obvious that it's the grass lawn. So I'm just going to come in a little bit smaller to give it that kind of finer detail. Now I can also change the opacity of this texture as well. So I can drag that in and make it a little lighter, or drag it back up to 100%. I can also rotate it as well if I just want maybe the angle of something to go in a different direction. We can also invert the mask. So if we just click on this here, we can invert it from the dark and the light contrast. So it depends really what you're looking for, but we'll stick to what we've already applied. Now that we've applied our texture, let's just zoom in and look at what the texture brush will bring us. Now that we've zoomed in, what we're going to do next is activate the texture brush panel. Now I've already got it open here, but if you want to access it, you can also get it from the toolbar by coming over to the texture tool, and then in the stack you can find the texture brush tool. Now as soon as you've activated it, you'll see that we've got an annotation, and this shows the size of the brush. Now we can adjust that here. I'm using a mouse for this, so I've got no Wacom pressure to use, but you can also use a Wacom tablet and pen for this as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce some of the hardness because I don't want it too harsh. If I paint across the edge, I'm going to get a very harsh mask. So let's just Command Z, go backwards, and I'm just going to reduce the hardness down to about 40%. I don't want it too much. And then what I can do is just start to paint away along the edge of this coastline. And what I'm going to do is get a nice softer mask. Now if I make the brush bigger, so we'll just Command Z again there. If I just make the brush a little bit bigger like so and start to paint away, you can see that you've got a much softer mask going on. So really it's a case of get the brush nice and big, get the hardness right, and get the position right, and you can paint this away. Now if you wanted to paint that back in, don't worry, you can just hold the Alt Option key down and you can just paint back, or you can use the opposite end of your Wacom pen, which is like using the eraser brush. So that's a really quick way of actually painting in and painting out. Now if you were to do some masking, and let's say we started to mask away some here and we mask away some here, and you wanted to reset the mask, you can just click this here, which is part of the expanded panel. Also if you wanted to say maybe do some masking, you've painted some out, you also wanted to reset the mask, but say you wanted the appearance of the texture to be much lower, then we can come in here and say change this to 30%, reset the mask, but it's also going to reset the mask at 30% opacity as well. So that's just if you missed it the first time round when you were adding the texture, you can still do it here. You can also invert the mask as well. So if we go back to 100%, reset that mask, let's say we start to paint some of this away at the top and the bottom. We can also invert the mask by clicking on this, and what that will do is flip that around. And again, just holding the Alt Option key, you can paint some of this back in if you want. So it depends really where you're looking to mask and where you're looking to add that texture. Now I'm just going to reset the mask again. One quick thing to note is the opacity brush behaves slightly different. What the opacity brush is going to do is actually mask away the object, not the actual texture. So let's just zoom out quickly. So now we've got this centered. If I come down to the opacity brush, what's going to happen is, say this object here, this is sitting on top of this blue, there's a blue object behind here. So if I actually start to use the opacity brush on, say, this orange area here, I'm just going to select that and I'm going to start painting. And what's going to happen is it's going to mask away the actual object, and that blue from the underneath is going to show through. If I just Command Z, I'll just make that brush a little bit bigger, and then what we'll do is we'll paint around again. And you can see there what I've actually done is I've masked the object, not the texture. So that's just the difference between the opacity brush and the texture brush. But as we've seen there, we can add some really nice texture to an object, and then we can mask some of it out so that we have some control over it. Now one extra thing you can do, if we come back over here to our item, we come back to Texturino. Let's just say that we don't want that particular texture of grass lawn. We're going to select a different one. So let's just come up here to Concrete Galaxy. Let's say I want this kind of effect here on there rather than grass. I can just come to this second icon, click on that, and what that's going to do is it's going to replace the original texture. So we can do the same thing here. We can change the opacity, we can change the scale, and we can also invert the mask as well. So we can go from dark to white depending on the contrast of this texture. So that's a quick overview of Texturino and the texture brush and the opacity brush. Now that we've done that, let's move on to the last item, which is Phantasm, which is going to give us some really cool live effect color control on our artwork. Okay, finally, let's look at Phantasm quickly. I'm not going to go too deep into Phantasm. It's a very powerful tool and there's a lot to it. So there's a lot of videos on our YouTube channel to cover this. I'm just going to show you a quick color change part of Phantasm. So what we're going to do is just come over here and select one of these colors. So we've got this orange here. Now what we can do with Phantasm is do what we would have done in Photoshop, which is control the hue, saturation and lightness. Now this isn't part of Native Illustrator, this is only in Phantasm. So with the color selected, what we can do is actually start to play with the hue of this. So we can go left to right and change the color. We can also change the saturation of that, and we can also change the lightness of that. Now the thing to note here, I'm just going to reset it quickly. The thing to note is you can see here this is orange, and if we go up to the color picker we can see that it's orange. So as I start to change the colors here, and we go say shift to the right to this green color, or we come over here to like the pink and purple, watch the color chip, it stays orange. That's because the underlying color remains the same. All we're doing is looking at an option alternative. Now if you want to actually select that color, you're going to have to expand that item, and then that will make the color live. But for the moment it stays as a live effect, so whatever changes you make to it, it is going to stay that way until you actually remove it or expand it. So let's just say we're going to change this to, let's come over here and change it to this kind of yellow color. So you can see here, because it's live we can turn it off, but we've got this great color control. We can also affect the brightness and the contrast of any item. We can also change this value here, which is also the exposure. We've also got these settings here where we can adjust the levels, the curves, we can create a duotone, and one of the most powerful parts of Phantasm is to be able to create some halftone, so you can do some really cool shading. And the beauty of Phantasm with that is you can actually use your own symbols as well. So if you wanted a very specific kind of halftone effect on some of your artwork, you can actually create a symbol and use that symbol as the halftone. And again, we've got lots of videos that cover that. Now we can also invert the object, so it will give you the opposite color. We'll just turn this off for the moment though. We're going to turn all these settings off and go back to normal. You can actually desaturate it as well, but like I said, there's lots here in Phantasm. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I just wanted to give you a kind of overview of how our tools work, how the live effects stay live, and how you can make changes to your map artwork. I hope that's whetted your appetite for our plugins. These are just a few of our full suite of 19 creative and time-saving tools for Adobe Illustrator. Now you can trial everything fully for 7 days. We also offer a full 7-day money-back guarantee if they're not for you, but we honestly think once you start using them, you are going to love them. Thanks for joining me in this tutorial, and please enjoy the remainder of your conference. And I'd like to thank Avenza for having Astute Graphics teach at the Avenza conference today.